Hi everyone, I'm Matt Landis with NGDU, and we are very happy to have Katherine Isbister, fresh out of GDC as part of the Serious Games at Google Tech Talk series. Katherine's a professor of computer science and digital media and the director of the Innovation Game Lab at NYU, among many, many other things. Katherine and I have been in an ongoing conversation over the last year about games and their potential impact on society, education, and human interaction. And what I love most about Katherine's perspective is the way she combines the reflective academic and the serious gamer. It sort of comes together in one person. So please join me in welcoming Katherine Isbister to Google.
Well, I'm super excited to be here. It was definitely worth sacrificing one day of GDC, and I hope you'll agree with me. I'm here to talk today about one of my passions as a researcher, which is how to bring more sophisticated understanding to the design of movement-based interaction. So, I want to start with the question of whether people think this is really the future of interface. How many people remember seeing this movie? Oh, it's no sound. Remember Minority Report? Right? And this kind of like data glove thing and these sort of really somewhat sinister gestures. And is this how you guys want to interface with the computer of the future? How many people think that would be really cool and fun? It's okay if you think so. Yeah, raise your hand and wave it. Excellent idea. Okay, so a few people. I'm going to show you what I think would be really cool. The audio on my laptop, so I hit mute. Okay. Here's what I think would be really cool as the future of movement and interface. See if I can get the sound up.
I'll shake that booty! Oh my god.
So you can hear her friend egging her on, and they're having the best time. And I'll turn off the sound. It's a really happy, silly, wonderful social experience. And I actually think movement has the potential to bring this to interacting with computers. And I'm not totally opposed to the Darth Vader-like approach. I think that can be really intense and cool and fun. But I think that approach is a little bit overrepresented in how we think about movement and technology. Now here's another idea. How many people have played Dance Central on the Kinect? A couple people. Okay, cool. I saw the most amazing talk about this game at GDC this week, and I highly recommend it. If you guys have access to the GDC Vault, go check it out. They go through, I think, like 10 or 12 prototypes of Dance Central and how they figured out how to teach people how to do the dance moves, how to have moves that weren't too hard, what was fun about it, and so forth. Really, really sophisticated. And what I liked about it is it showed that it's actually possible to get people doing really interesting full-body complex movement as part of engaging with technology. And as we have things like the Kinect, but with a lot better resolution and ability to track us, we will have access to that kind of motion, right? And I think this game shows that it's actually possible to make movement like that accessible and really fun and really interesting. And that's another paradigm. And I'll get into why I think that's interesting a little bit as we go on. So the truth is that the future is already here, right? I mean, now is the time, especially since last year with the advent of the Move and the Kinect, when almost everybody has in their home very sophisticated sensor-based ways to engage with the console machines sitting in their living room. So how many people here have a Kinect? How about a Move? Anybody have the Move? How about a Wii? More people have the Wii, right? Okay. And also, this is scaring the bejesus actually out of the games industry, which is that these kinds of platforms now have really sophisticated sensors and multitouch and cameras and so forth, and are starting to have really amazing experiences like games and gaming experiences themselves, and they're a much, much broader market. And they're even more of a bridge into everyday interaction with technology, right? So essentially the future is already here. You already have a palette of movement-based devices that you can use to create interactions with software, right? And I have to show this. How many people have seen this video? This is really impressive. Okay, one person. It's amazing. This is a cat interacting with an iPad. And I know you're going to laugh at me about the idea of trans-species opportunities with platforms, but I mean, think about pet insurance. Does anybody here have pet insurance now for their cat or dog? You wouldn't believe the giant market that pets have become, okay? So, I mean, I'm kind of being tongue-in-cheek here, but on the other hand, I'm not. It's what has happened with the iPad and the iPhone is that there's become a tremendous number of applications for little children, okay? I have a 4-year-old, and she grasped the touch-based interface right away, okay? Just like this cat, basically. This cat is playing with this imaginary stuff on this screen, just like it would with, you know, a real ball. And that's pretty astounding, right? There are also researchers who have been studying how the elderly interact with touchpads, and have found similarly that people who get really lost with the mouse and keyboard and really complex menu structures have a much easier time dealing with multi-touch interfaces. So this is just going to be so ubiquitous, and people are going to be doing more and more of their everyday computing on these devices, people and their pets. Okay. So that's just pretty awesome.
My dog ate my homework. It's a whole new meeting.
Truly, my dog deleted my homework, right? So you might think, because it's movement, and movement is something we do every day, that this is really intuitive and easy to do, but the truth is it's really not. It's actually really hard to design good movement and gestural-based interfaces, and it's really easy to lose the gains that we've made in designing all these consistent rules for things like graphical user interfaces. If you want to see an excellent rant about this, I highly recommend Don Norman's rant about how, you know, touch-based interface is a step backwards in terms of consistency and all kinds of things. And also I would refer you to this really great talk by the harmonics team at GDC about how many mistakes they made along the way in trying to teach people how to do these dance moves and how complicated that turned out to be. So you guys are really data-driven people. This is a concept that Will Wright uses a lot that I find really useful, which is this notion that, you know, if you just go into a space without really understanding it, you can, without realizing it, design towards local maxima in the design space, and you can achieve something really great for this little design territory that you've decided is the ultimate and the best possible choice, but you could just be way off base in terms of what would actually be optimal in thinking about designing the solutions. And so I'm going to present you 2 of these that I think people often fall into in designing what are now called natural user interfaces, or NUIs. It's kind of the buzzword. One of them is making the mistake of thinking that the person should act like a machine. In other words, if you look at even some of the gestures with the Kinect, or if you looked at that Minority Report video, you can see these sort of robot-like, does anybody remember the robot dance? Right? Like some of those gestures are very robotic and linear, right? And part of that is because that's easier to recognize. So how many people have ever seen Very Nervous System by David Rokeby? Anybody? Let me show you the video while I tell you the story. So David Rokeby is a really brilliant Canadian artist, and he was one of the first people to design a reactive system that would track your movement. Let's see if I can just cut right to his interactions with the system, which look pretty kooky. He's kind of a kooky-looking guy, okay? So basically what the system would do is it would generate dynamic music, and this was in the 80s, in response to David's movement. So he handcrafted this whole thing, and he's a gallery-style artist, so he told this wonderful story. I was at the Banff Institute, and he told a story about this horrible thing that happened to him, which is that he took this piece and he installed it in the gallery, he tested it, it was working great, he was ready for opening night. All the people came in, and it didn't work at all. It wasn't responding to their movements at all. And he was like, what happened? He was completely freaked out. He tested himself. It's still working fine. So he goes back and he looks at his videos. He was videotaping himself interacting with the technology. The system had trained him to move in these bizarre ways, okay? He had entrained himself to move in really strange ways that the tech picked up extremely well. It happened completely unconsciously. And so he was able to use the thing brilliantly, like a master of this instrument, but no one else could play it because it wasn't actually intuitive at all. And I think, it's great that we're really plastic as human beings, and we've definitely taken advantage of that over the years with these, with all the limitations we've had with processing power. We simply had to behave more like machines for the machines to understand what we were doing. But that's really no longer the case. We have the processing power. We have commercial-grade sensors out in people's living rooms, and we don't need to move like robots anymore. But I think we still carry this strange kind of local maxima of act like a machine in how we think about crafting and designing these interactions, okay? The other one that I think a lot of people fell into in designing the early Wii games that I think Nintendo was masterful at avoiding was, it's the same thing as the problem with endlessly chasing the ultimate VR augmented reality situation, which is being overly literal about creating highly realistic movement. And the harmonics guys actually told a really interesting story about this. They said that they were pretty close to locking down for development, and they had come up with all these dance moves. They worked with a choreographer. They were ready to go. And then they started doing testing, like really extensive testing, and they realized that how they had thought about the progression was they would sort of gradually unlock moves, and there were certain moves they were putting towards the beginning that they thought were really easy, but even those moves were incredibly hard for people who weren't good dancers to do. And they had gotten all caught up in having this highly realistic and really engaging choreography just like real dance, and hadn't been thinking enough about what was accessible and approachable and engaging for this tremendous market they were trying to reach. So they actually did a really funny thing. They posted internally and asked people who had like 2 left feet, who were like white males, who hated to dance, like everybody who totally hated to dance, was always traumatized by going to any school dance. They got them all like in a bus and took them over to the dance studio where they'd been working on the game, and they had an emergency re-engineering of the choreography, like basically a sort of like a basics, like a dance for dummies kind of training session where they quickly came up with some moves that were super accessible to somebody who really felt like they had 2 left feet. And they said, oh, that really, really saved the game, because they realized, it's not about being Michael Jackson or whoever, Lady Gaga, right, playing this game. It's actually about offering people this kinesthetic feeling of being a wonderful dancer. And you probably do that better by giving them moves that are kind of easier that they could really pull off, because then they feel really graceful. So it's the same thing with designing, game worlds. You want to make people, you want to almost think of like a hyper reality where you're magically more graceful and more interesting and more flawless in your performance than you are in everyday life, right? It's like even in The Sims, it's kind of bizarre that you have to, take them to the restroom. It's kind of like a funny joke, but you rarely see that in movies. They're parts of everyday kinesthetic reality that we really don't need to imitate, and we certainly don't need to do that in interface either. I think people get excited about that as a challenge and go chasing that, and certainly from a technical perspective, it's really interesting to see how precise sensors can be, but it doesn't mean we always want to design in exactly that way. So how do you tackle this design challenge? Well, one way you can do it is you can actually, offer a cash prize, which is what happened. There's this OpenNI Kinect library, and PrimeSense sponsored this competition, and they wanted people to create a natural web browsing interaction. And this one was pretty cool. I actually tried to see a demo of it at GDC, but it wasn't working, which is the bane of all demos. Let's see if I can skip to the swimming part. This is really kind of a cool idea, which is basically that you swim through the web. And this is actually a free library that you can directly hook into. You can go buy a Kinect. We use it with Unity 3D, which is a game engine, but you could use it pretty much with anything. And this guy hooked up his web browser. So you swim forward to open a link, and then you sort of backpedal to back out of a link and kind of swim to the right, swim to the left, right? It's a very dreamy kind of, pleasant and relaxing way to interact with the web. Now, I'm not saying this is the be-all and end-all, and of course, even if you had like 10,000 applications developed in this way and people voted on them, you still wouldn't really understand, well, why do they work? Why are they successful? So, my answer to tackling this question is to wear many hats, some of which are very silly. We actually made these hats in my lab. But what I do is I combine thinking about this problem from a human-computer interaction approach and a very designy approach, and using my background in social science, and having a deep respect for what games, commercial games, have already begun to do in terms of making the user experience really important, the moment-to-moment experience. So these are some of the weird things that we do in my lab. We build strange evaluation tools. This is called the Sensual Evaluation Instrument. Ask me later if you want to know what it does. We build research prototype games that allow us to pull data out of the games and do controlled comparisons and interesting things with them. And I'll walk you through a project like that today. And I have books and other things you can read later if you want to. So I'm going to tell you today a little bit about this emotion in motion project that we've been doing as trying to tackle this question of how do you start to develop a design language for interesting movement-based interaction. So basically my approach is I go to the social science literature about how people work. And I try to figure out, well, where are the sweet spots for thinking about how to use a new technology that's going to work really well with people. And then we've been creating games as research instruments because I think you have to have fairly rich prototypes to explore some of these ideas. You have to have something that's dynamic and engaging enough that you can see if it's working or not. All towards applying this to interesting application areas, including education. And that's how Matt and I actually met. So some of the social science we're using, and I can get into more detail on any of this if you're curious. One thing is the physical feedback loop. How many people know about this phenomenon? One person. So let me describe this study. Basically, these social psychologists told the people in their study that they were going to test out a hands-free interface. They told half the people that they had to hold it like this, and the half like this. This activates your smile muscles, and this activates your frown muscles, okay? At the end of this interaction with this device, the people who had been unconsciously smiling rated the device statistically significantly higher than the ones who had been frowning, right? And they never really realized that they were doing this. So this is a really powerful thing in us, and this is why your mom said stand up straight and act confident, because that's part of how you decide how you feel. You're getting signals from your body. So with a game mechanic, if you have somebody performing as if they feel a certain way, they're going to start self-labeling as feeling that way. So that's a really interesting and powerful effect that we can use. Another one is emotional contagion. How many people have heard of this or maybe heard of mirror neurons, that kind of thing? Okay. So the theory is basically that since we are social animals from way back, it's evolutionarily very viable for us to be very susceptible to one another's feelings. So if one of us gets really alarmed, the others are like, oh, what's wrong? So if there's some danger in the jungle, then we can all quickly respond to it. So what that means is that we do that all the time, even with media, even with things like TV. If somebody looks really sad on TV, if you watch the person who's watching and they're really into the movie, they start to look a little sad too. And in their brains, to some degree, it's kind of the same as if they themselves were feeling sad. So it's super powerful. And this really comes into play with performative and physical games like broad body games because it's so much more legible when you're witnessing the game. It's a lot different than console play, which sometimes has that zombie look like, there are intense feelings going on, but you can't really see them from the sides. But when somebody is playing adventure on Kinect, you can see them getting excited. And so you're much more likely to get excited too. And then kind of an extension of that is this whole notion, has anybody ever done the stadium wave? Yeah, a couple of people. This is super fun. It's weird how good it feels to get into synchrony with other people. And there are all kinds of strange studies about this. Like, here's one you can try in a meeting. Take a sort of a strange posture, and then wait and see who also takes the posture. I guarantee you, probably one other person will. It'll be the person who agrees with you the most, and it's kind of the most on your team. It's the weirdest thing. So this is why, like, salespeople, they actually will imitate your body language to get you to feel like you're in sync. Now, think about game mechanics and movement mechanics. When you have two people doing things, you can actually have them doing stuff together. They'll feel more trust and liking for one another. It's wild. So how we approached this in the lab was first we started to unpack the Wii games. That's what was out there at the time, to really break down with more nuance, like what was happening in terms of movement in those games, what was engaging and not engaging about them, and whether we could start to create some dimensions along which we could design. basically. And then we did a series of studies in our lab and also out in a school, actually, because we're part of this Games for Learning Institute at NYU. And then we created this research prototype. So I'm going to just show you little segments of this process. And right now, we're building a math game trying to make use of some of these ideas. So we played a lot of Wii games and looked at, what kinds of movements were fun and weren't and why. And one thing we realized was that happy-go-lucky loose movement is much more silly and positive and friendly than sort of tight, controlled movement. And I'll show you these two videos. This is actually an actor performing along certain dimensions of this Laban movement analysis. It's like a dance notation, but it's a really great illustration. So this is floating. This is maybe more slow than a lot of the mechanics we saw that people liked on the Wii, but just really light and joyful and mellow and happy, trippy kind of, right? And contrast that with this sort of slashing motion. This one on the right is super fun if you're doing like a Star Wars lightsaber game, right? Because you feel like, whoa, I'm really powerful. It's kind of has this whole different vibe, right? But both kinds of movements are pretty flowing and allow the rest of the body to get into the game. And that was something that we saw that seemed to be really important. Just like a little micro comparison, here is a game called Wii Cheer that people did like a lot. And it's basically a cheerleading game. But even the guys in my lab were like, oh yeah, cheerleading, this is fun, because it had fairly free-flowing movements and it allowed the rest of the body to get involved. This was a game called Boogie Superstar. And it was also a dancing game, but basically they took this approach where you had to move like a machine. You had to do your movements to a very strict metronome. So all of a sudden you were kind of doing the robot as you were dancing. It wasn't nearly as much fun. It was much more mechanical and complicated to try to do. So we were starting to see, oh, wow, there's actually some nuances of movement that seem to really shift the character of how people feel about interacting. So I'll show you some footage from my in-lab study. And we did just video recording. These are some dancers doing Wii Cheer also, because we were sort of curious about, well, what happens when there are people who are really super good at the kind of thing the game is teaching, as opposed to people who are novices? Do we get really different kinds of motion? And one thing you can really see in this video is if you look behind the two who are performing, you can see how engaged the women who are just watching are and how they get so into the action emotionally. You can see it in their faces. And they had really interesting things to say also about how you train movement and how the various games did a good or bad job of training movement. And that's another interesting factor in terms of if you're going to innovate new interaction strategies, you have to think about how you're going to teach them. So I won't show this footage because this is middle school girls, and we don't usually show the video of classroom studies. But essentially what we went out and did was I wanted to validate this intuition that, like, everybody has this intuition that more movement is more fun and leads to more energy and so forth, but I couldn't find any research that really validated that. So we did a study where we had low, medium, and high movement Wii games. So low was Mario Kart, medium was Wii Cheer, and high was Wii Boxing. Has anybody played Wii Boxing? It's like super vigorous, right? So we went into the schools, and then we had these little clickers, and the girls, after every round, would self-rate how they were feeling, like how happy, how frustrated, how much fun, and what their energy level was, just so we could see what would happen. And we actually did like hours and hours of video coding afterwards for level of movement, so we could validate for ourselves, was it really low, medium, and high? And yes, it was. So our hypothesis was, well, everybody thinks that more movement leads to more positive emotion and energy and so forth. What we found, interestingly, was it didn't seem to be related to fun or sort of positive emotion, but it was definitely related to energy levels. So the more you were forced to move in the game, the more energized you felt at the end, which is, not surprising, but it's good to check it out. And we actually have a Laban movement analysis analyst coding the video now, she's really interested in whether she can actually see frustration as it forms in the body. And since we have all this self-report of frustration data at a pretty micro level, she's going to use that to cross-check her observations. So that's sort of cool. So then we went on to create a research prototype. Oh, and I have a paper about that work if anyone wants it. It's in submission right now, but I'm happy to share it with you. So then we did a research prototype. And of course, there are a lot of things that vary between Mario Kart, Wii Cheer, and Wii boxing besides amount of movement, right? So the most ideal way to test out this theory is to actually design a game where the only thing you vary is movement. And so that's what we did. And we used these silly hats because we wanted to make sure that people would move a lot, because sometimes with Wiimotes, people cheat. They figure out the accelerometer thing, and they're less likely to do it when they have it on their head. Also, it was just really fun. So let me just show you a brief little video about Wriggle. One of my students composed this music. We also had him do pen and paper measures to see how that compared with nodding your way into self-reporting your emotions, which might be less objective. We just thought it would be really fun to do. My students hate this video. They took a video of me playing the game and put it up on our website as revenge, which was fun. Yeah, these are grad students. And people did start pushing one another when they played this game to knock each other off balance, which was sort of interesting. That's Chelsea's happy dance because she won. So I think you guys get the idea. So this is actually a work in progress presentation at Chi. I don't know if anybody's going to be there in May, but we'll have the game set up so you can come and play it if you want to. So what we found? We found the same pattern that we did with the school study, which is that, and you can see the little graphs here, you know, for valence, which is positive versus negative emotion, it was equally fun, really, to play the game, whether you had the movement or not. But we definitely got a significant effect for energy level. People felt much more energized afterwards. And we also got this really interesting effect. It was not a significant effect, but something that I'm planning to go after, which is people who played with the hats felt much more of a sense of social connectedness after going through that experience compared to the people who played with the keyboard. So it sort of underscores the interesting social aspects of thinking about this stuff. Okay, so let me talk about how we're using this stuff in relation to like practical concerns. While I was doing this research, somebody showed me this fascinating study. How many people have heard of this power pose study? Okay, one person. This is just really bizarre. It was some people from Harvard and Columbia, and they had people either be in this, this high power pose or a low power pose for 10 minutes. And basically, they made them spit into a cup before and after, and they measured their hormone levels. And then they also offered them some fake money to like make a bet to see how risky of a bet they would make. People who stood in high power poses, literally their testosterone went up, their cortisol went down, and they were much more likely to make very confident and kind of risky bets. And people who were forced to stay in these low power poses just for 10 minutes had a significant impact on them, like biochemically as well as behaviorally, which is, I was like, whoa. So I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about kids who have math anxiety, because I've been in this Games for Learning Institute, and I was like, I've already seen how I can change people's energy level. What if I could literally make someone feel more confident while they're doing math? And then maybe that would kind of break the cycle of them being really anxious, right? So we have a little, this is super rough. It's much more polished now. I would love to be able to show you guys the demo live, but you'll just have to see this super crappy. Like, this was like in January. Basically, we came up with this very, very simple math game idea, which is you're landing fractions on a number line, okay? And so in one condition of the math game, you have to keep expanding the number line in order to catch the fractions. So you're inadvertently taking these really strong power poses. And I actually ran this past the woman who did the research in New York City, and she's like, oh yeah, that'll be great. She's going to look at our prototypes, so just to double check. In the other condition, you have to keep the number line kind of small, and you have to constantly catch things a little bit lower to the ground, so you're being forced to stay in the low power pose condition. So we're piloting this spring in a local middle school, and if it goes well, there's this really interesting experiment in New York called the School of One, which has highly customized math learning, and they've said they're willing to actually pilot this to a much greater number of kids. So I would just be so excited if this actually works, and I would have loved to learn math this way. But anyway, this is just to show like a super practical use of this in case you were starting to feel like, oh, this is so evil empire, like influence people's feelings, very insidious. So it can be used for the forces of good, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then in terms of next steps, I'm really interested in building from these kinds of research-based building blocks to rethink how we approach gesture. I feel like we have a window of opportunity here where it's not all totally set in stone. It's, how like the whole story about the Dvorak keyboard and the QWERTY keyboard and so forth. I think we have this moment now where it's not all completely locked down, where there's a chance to actually get some really interesting social and emotional considerations into play in these devices that we all interact with every day. And I think it has all kinds of implications for people's wellness, for education, for all kinds of areas. I personally would, instead of sitting on my butt at my desk all day, sorting email out of my inbox, like why can't it be more like gardening? Or like cooking together? Like why can't my mundane data processing task actually be healthful and social for me? And with these kinds of devices, there's not really a reason why that can't happen, except for a lack of imagination, in my opinion. So this is like a recent open library of multi-touch gestures. And I think this kind of work is very valuable and fine, but it feels like that robot thing all over again. It feels like, okay, let's all act like robots and come up with these very efficient sort of least common denominator movements. I think there's a role for that kind of thinking, but I would rather see something like this, right? Like why not have Gmail Tai Chi, right? Like why not? If you have a Kinect in your living room, couldn't you sort your email that way into folders? Wouldn't that be great? You could do that in the morning. Maybe it wouldn't be so horrible to go through your inbox, right? You wouldn't have to declare inbox bankruptcy. You'd be in so much better shape after sorting your email. You'd be like, I sorted my email, I'm just saying. And personally, I think the way to get there is, first of all, to really understand the science of what happens to people through movement and through gesture and dive into that side of things, understand essentially how we're hardwired and how we use these things in our everyday life, and really think about moving with that material. And it has huge impact on our emotions, on how we connect to other people, and moving around. There's this research that I read recently in the Times where you can't just go get on an exercise bicycle for 30 minutes and sit the rest of the day. You're in just as bad a shape as somebody who never got on the bike, right? So we need to find a way to incorporate movement all day long into our lives. And so I think that there's a lot of possibility there. And so I guess it's an incitement to think past the more robot sort of local maxima into another space that isn't necessarily gestural like hyperrealism, but is something that augments our everyday lives in really wonderful ways. And in case you think this is not practical, I want to tell you the story about the pretty ATM machine. Has anybody read this in an HCI textbook? So basically, I think this research was done first in Japan and then validated in Israel, that for some weird reason, people would report identical button structures as easier to use on more aesthetically pleasing ATM machines. It was like, easier to use? And it did seem like it was more efficient for them. They're actually being more efficient. So the Israelis who replicated the study were like, we think we figured out why this is so. And the reason is because of this thing called mild positive affect. Has anyone heard of this? Basically, it's this idea that when you're in sort of a mildly happy mood, you're much more creative, okay? You problem solve better. So the Israelis' theory was you actually make people slightly smarter by putting them into a little bit better of a mood. through the aesthetics, okay? So if that's true for graphics, I think that would be very true for gesture. And I think that's part of the reason why Apple is kicking everybody else's butt with their early multi-touch devices, okay? Because they figured out this gesture thing really fast. And I have a colleague who talks about how that initial, how many people have an iPhone? Okay? That initial interaction where you unlock it, she compared that to petting a little kitty cat. She said, the very first interaction you have with that device is like a little caress. It's not like a button press. And it's not like, I mean, I love Android too, but it's like those like unlock, the little connect the dots thing. It's like, right? But this is like, right? And so I think this is pretty potent stuff, right? So and maybe this is partly because my husband's allergic to cats and I can't have a cat, but I would like all of my technology to be much more like, playing with a kitty cat or the kitty cat can play with it for that matter, rather than me having to eternally do the robot. So that is my talk. I'm happy to take questions.
So I think the second part of your argument that I heard is, okay. Yeah, that's right, for people other than this room. So I was trying to understand the second part of your argument, connecting it to the first, is
Right.
the thesis that even in areas, like if you're trying to design a gestural UI, not for fun purposes, but for, quote unquote serious purposes, having people have fun with it a little bit and being in that mild positive affect is going to make a more useful user interface.
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. So right now I'm working with a professor who does security applications at my university. And we're working on authentication techniques. And he's really interested in the biometric aspect of it. But my argument is people hate typing in passwords. They come up with crappy passwords they use over and over again. If you design like kind of an awkward, annoying gesture, if you design a gesture that feels really good to do, guess what? People are going to comply more. So there are very practical areas, not just sort of a subtle, more positive affect, but also just we can change how much people want to perform certain tasks they may have to perform anyway through the design of the movement.
So would you say it's safe to say that you could adopt a similar research approach, even if you're designing a successful UX, even if your goal isn't to make a game?
Oh, absolutely. So I think game developers have an evolutionary pressure on them, which is that consumers either buy or don't buy the game only based on whether it's fun. So they're at the vanguard of understanding that moment-to-moment engagement and how to maintain it. So I'm actually an HCI person. I came to games because I was like, why do avatars and characters work in games and nobody could make it work? Like, remember the Microsoft paperclip? That's how I got to games. So I actually think games are a very interesting space to watch more for that experiential expertise.
I agree with you that I think the games are on the bleeding edge of UX design in theory. Mm-hmm. I really do. But I'm a hardcore gamer coming from the game industry. So, does anyone else?
Just sort of following on from that question. So I've been reading a little bit about games, and one of the things I've been reading, which I'm not sure if this is a mainstream view, is that one of the things that's fun for people about games is that they have unnecessary obstacles, that people actually like games that are difficult and challenge them, but that necessary obstacles are not fun in the same way. Like if your boss puts a lot of obstacles in your path,
right.
That's not actually fun for you.
Yeah.
So when doing experiments on how fun these sort of movement-based games are, how can you separate out the part of the fun that comes from an unnecessary obstacle that might not be fun in a real-life interface from the kind of fun that's like through the grace and sort of happy aspect of the movement?
I think it's a deep consideration of mapping. I mean, if you think of Hutchins and Norman and I think you want to map that arc of experience of kind of the naughty problem, like not naughty like AU, but KNOTTY. Like that's fun to unravel too, and that is a big part of what games deliver. They sort of deliver this, whoa, I'm really frustrated, I'm doing something really hard. Oh, that was so great, this kind of arc of experience. Like, I don't think it's all about easy fun. I think that's only like a first layer of what makes games compelling. So definitely what I presented here is more that surface of ease people's way into the movement experience. But I think there's also, like, if you think about the Move, which is Sony's device, it's probably the most accurate of the three devices. And I could really see people developing very refined ways to move through data or to investigate things that are very kinesthetic and precise. And there might be some kind of like pulling weeds in a garden. There might be some very laborious parts of that that are strangely satisfying, right? So it's not just all about like ease. Yeah, I didn't mean to give that impression.
Actually, I had two questions, but one was the cheating you mentioned. I have a couple of friends who bought the Wii. They have all the gaming consoles, and they bought the Wii. And the guy beat Zelda kind of like laying on the couch, just like flicking it, because he figured out all the motions.
Yes.
And then it was not really any fun.
Yes.
What have you seen in terms of, is it a type of user who cheats, or is it a type of game that causes the user to cheat? Are there ways to bring them back and get them engaged?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think if you're a hardcore gamer and you're used to the precision of a console device, like a handheld controller, the designer has to really win you over with the movement-based interaction, and the Wiimote is not that accurate. So I actually gave a talk at GDC last year about the nuances of designing that kind of kinesthetic realism, and I contrasted like Star Wars: The Force Unleashed, which was this lightsaber game which had some really great movement stuff, but also some really complicated combinations of buttons and movement, and people would sometimes kind of back off to the flicking thing, with another game, which now I can't remember the title, but basically it was all button stuff, so it maintained the tight control, except for like going in for the kill, which was like this. And so it just isolated the most fun, crazy, like crescendo, and the hardcore gamers loved that, because they didn't lose the control and they still got kind of the big payoff movement, right? So I think it's a combination, right? Whereas if you come to these games without any gaming experience, something like, have you seen Boom Blocks? It's sort of like Jenga, like you pull out the little tiles, like that one works really well. It's very natural and intuitive and fun because there's not all that baggage about precise control embedded into the genre and the audience and the expectations. So I think it's kind of a mix.
Gotcha. So it's not about well, it is about the type of person. There are some people, and you have to win them over.
Or you're just they're entrained in something and
Yeah.
stuff. Also, I think like at least in the U.S., like guys have kind of like performing physically, doing crazy things physically is like okay. Like there's definitely that kind of tendency to.
That was
back
actually my
off.
second question. Was my
Yeah.
favorite thing about the Kinect is the menu navigation.
Mm-hmm.
Really intuitive to just learn how to work your way through a game. But then I really didn't like dancing unless I've had enough drinks.
Yeah.
And I have the same thing on my tablet. So I'll dock my tablet to a Bluetooth keyboard and I type my email away.
Mm-hmm.
But I like touching and swiping the major actions.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen a lot of games that support that. Or do you know if developers are aware of that combination of more buttons and then menus for just sort of swiping and partial elements?
I think you're going to see more sophisticated mixes in the next year in how Kinect games operate. I mean, I think that was such a radical evolution, and I think Microsoft put out certain standards, and I think everybody's still getting the hang of that blend. Plus, with Kinect, you've got the voice recognition, right? So it's really hard to figure out what the right combination is. But I think we'll have a hybrid world. I mean, we'll still have to type sometimes, but if language recognition gets really, really good and we're not in a crowded environment, we may talk to our computer a lot of the time. You know what I mean? I think we'll have to think very multimodal, and maybe that will allow these gestural interfaces to do things they do well. Like I do think sorting, and it's the same thing as you see how the apps on the iPad are very different. Like I'm really interested in seeing iMovie on the iPad. Like how do you do video editing with just a touch-based interface, and does that feel good? And the
You
precision
should try it on
control.
Android Zoom. We have a
I
nice
should,
little movie
I should,
editor.
yes. Sorry, I don't mean to be an
And actually,
ad for Apple.
Gmail on the new Android tablet is actually pretty nice because you can just swipe your emails into boxes. So you have this nice flicking motion.
Yeah.
Like, I'm done with that email.
I will definitely
but then
check
you
it
type.
out.
Hi. So, to start with, I'm having a great deal of trouble connecting with what you're saying. I guess, I'm white, I'm male, I'm English, I don't drink.
Right.
My favorite computer games are logistical games.
Right.
I like managing buses and trains.
Yes.
And I get really frustrated that the interfaces don't have macros. because I want to type a program that explains what I want the train to do and then have
Right.
it execute. And
Yep.
I do not want any real-time elements at all. Thank you very much.
Yep.
So you come from another planet. I'm sorry. At the same time, I actually work on Gmail, and I came to hear you talk because I was thinking, so how can Gmail be better? How can we? Because all my life I've been waiting for physical manipulations to happen to data. I've always wanted to send files by dragging them across to my friend and letting my friend have them. But I still can't put it together, and maybe it's because I have trouble with the emotional connection.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I need my mail interface to be something that will work when I'm on the bus. I need it to be something that works when I'm in the office.
Yeah.
I need it to be something that works when there's someone else in the room with me.
Mm-hmm.
And dancing isn't going to do that, even if it possibly provides some of the ideas. So this is a pathetic question. Help me put these things together.
Well, so I think you have to imagine that this is a modality for interaction, and that it will be valuable in the future to bring people's bodies into play and engaging with their everyday digital work life, right? So that, sure, I don't think it'll ever go away that you want that, especially with something like email where it's very text-based and you're reading it and you need to have all kinds of different screens and that kind of standardization. I think you should see it more as another avenue into engaging with that data, right? And I mean, maybe another way to look at it is to consider all the work that's being done with data visualization and exploration, and thinking about, I think about people like, I know people who work at places like Pixar who do like 3D modeling, and touch is a very promising way to help those people who are manipulating things to do their work in a more fluid and approachable manner. And that may turn out to be the case with data management and visualization to some degree for all of us, including things like email. Like how many things do I have from this person versus that one? Those kinds of big picture, global view things like sorting. I mean, I don't think it would ever replace you directly coding an application. I just think it's another layer, or it's another lens that can come into play. It's just like how we were all struggling at first with how do you put the web on a small mobile device? Do you completely change the interface? Things like online banking that look really different. Do you try to find some way to have some standard? I mean, I see it as the same struggle. And I mean, I think there's a really wonderful book by this woman called Maxine Sheets Johnstone that's all about getting into your physical body and trying out strange exercises to make you aware of the manner in which you move through the world physically. Like, she has things like, make up your bed as if you're frantically late. Okay, now make up your bed as if you just got back from a 2-month vacation in Hawaii. And then she sort of walks you through, notice how you tuck in the sheets. It's like, and noticing how that makes you feel. Like, so I don't know. I mean, I think that you can get it as I have it on my Kindle reader. So like, I would encourage you to explore that if you're kind of like, what is she talking about?
Okay, so I
weird.
realize there's a second thing that I should be asking, which is, you're talking about things that people do for fun. But what about intellectual pursuits? What do we know about how people behave and how they move when they're doing something intellectually? I know when I'm talking to someone, I lean forward, I lean back. There are changes in my facial expression.
Yes.
If I'm French, I move my hands a lot. And I think if I took a movie of myself playing with Lego, which is a physical pursuit I greatly enjoy, you'd see a lot of those things going on. They're sort of not conscious things that I'm doing in order to manipulate the world, but they're presumably exploitable cues.
Absolutely.
Do you think there are prospects, perhaps?
Oh, definitely.
for-
There's these parallel systems of approach and avoid that are really well documented in how people behave physiologically, and that sort of approach movement, right? Like you lean in, you're interested, you're engaging, versus the kind of shrinking back. I mean, there are some very practical, pragmatic, sort of survival-based areas of this work. So,
I just want to jump in and see, is there anybody on the remote locations who has a question?
So I have a question that's more for like power users or hardcore users, going back to like both of their points. So for instance, like in my case, when I play games, I'm like very competitive, so like almost competition level. And so I'm wondering, like, so for all these things, it's very convenient and it's very nice when you try to introduce it to new people who don't know anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
But then for me, for instance, like I can't, like the reason why I don't have a Wii, a Kinect, or like any of those is because it just doesn't work for me. Like it doesn't work. Like I can't get, how many ever actions I need in order to feel like I'm doing what I need to do. So do you have any like plans to address or try to help like hardcore users really transition over?
Well, I think that hardcore game genres that have evolved on console controllers are a really beautiful thing that I would not want to mess with. It's sort of like I've skied my whole life, and when I was like in my early 30s, I tried out snowboarding. And snowboarding is great, but I was like, ugh, I suck at this. I don't really want to master this. It's kind of drifty. I can't ski super fast on a snowboard. And I sort of abandoned it. I was like, I'm not interested in this. I already have this other thing I'm doing. So I wouldn't think of it as a substitution, like, oh, you as a hardcore gamer now have to use this thing. I think some of the developers made that mistake. I don't think that's true at all. It's like telling somebody who plays the violin, okay, now your violin's going to have a lot of buttons and you'll blow into it like an oboe. Wow, isn't that cool? Don't you want to do that with your mom? It's like, no. Okay, well, for some people it's cool. But you know what I'm saying. Like, I think that's a confused message that's somehow propagated in the press. And I think of console gaming like that as sort of like the virtuoso piano playing. Like you wouldn't just change the piano. We're creating different instruments for engagement.
You mentioned a couple of examples where the motion to play the game makes you feel better, such as the smiling when you have to...
Right.
Smiling versus puckering or frowning. Have you studied at all how much those factors lead to repeat play or like more play?
No, I haven't. I think that'd be a really interesting question. And I'm actually starting to think, after my research, that what physical gaming really does is it changes your arousal rate and then use other cues to decide what the valence of your emotion is. So the physical feedback stuff with the pen was your face. And your face has some more hardwired kind of positive, negative valence stuff. But I sort of think with the body, I don't know, I think there's the approach avoid axis, and I think there's energy level, but I think we do a lot of contextual labeling of, oh, I feel really, and then it's either terrified or excited based on what's happening in the world. So, but I think that's a really interesting question. I definitely want to follow up on that.
So has there been much work on using motion interfaces when there isn't visual feedback? Which it seems in almost all games rely pretty heavily on that.
Yeah.
I've been wondering about, for example, in cars where you shouldn't be looking at all the controls and everything else, or on your phone. Is there some useful results there that maybe can help us there?
I haven't seen useful scientific results, but I've seen some pretty interesting, strange, independent games. And there's a real movement among the independent game community to get away from social gaming where you're both still staring open-mouthed at the screen. Like they were like, wow, we want people to look at each other while they play. So I think it'll be an interesting space to watch. But I don't know of any sort of scientifically grounded, non-visual literature.
Hi there. You talked about avoiding the local maxima in your search space, which I was very interested in your example of the Dance Central, where they did all this polish, and then at the last minute they brought in what I guess was their target users, and they couldn't use it. Is that?
Well, it sort of crept up on them, I think. I mean, they tried really hard to make it super accessible. They did realize early on that someone who absolutely hates dancing, they could never really get up and dance. They were like, well, we have to have someone who's at least willing to try. But I think what they did was they got so caught up in working with the choreographers and planning out the moves, and they themselves became more expert at the moves, that they had that classic thing where they kind of lost their beginner's mind. And then when they went out and tested it, they're like, oh no, it's too hard. And that happens all the time with games. It's a big problem in gaming.
I guess the follow-up was you also talked a little bit about like perhaps you could say, how much polish do you need in like a prototype? Do you think when you can get something valid out of the testing?
Yeah.
Like it sounds like they went really far before they did.
No, actually,
No?
that's why you should get a hold of their talk, because they
Okay.
literally showed all of their prototypes, and one of their main points in their talk was, you have the moral responsibility with these dynamic systems to fake your way into a good enough prototype as early as possible when you can still make changes. And they were super creative about it. They did Wizard of Oz stuff. It was really cool. I was like, that's why they're really good at what they do. And I mean, I got really intrigued by the culture of design at Harmonix. I was like, how did they do that? Because a lot of HCI people don't do that, right? But yeah, I mean, I think the trick is the dynamics have to be tight. But the visual fidelity doesn't always have to be so tight. And that's not how we usually think. So, I mean, and that was the nugget I took away. But I don't think you have to have I think you have to have highly resolved timing to see if one of these things works. But you can fake that a lot of the time. Yeah. Yeah.
I just had one interesting contrasting comment. So I'm a project manager who loves working on projects that have engineers like, was Steven? What's your name? Yeah. Who think so critically about every little bullet. And but what I do is I get up on the board early in the project and I gesture. And I gesture how the data is going to flow. And I would love it if my gestures just turned into the program one day.
Yes.
Or if there was a way to us to both sit around a table with Lego blocks and build the application flow and hit submit, and off it goes. So I think a combination of the two really works.
That sounds like a very cool app. I hope you guys build that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.